Okay, so we've got our gems all spawning in nicely and being randomly assigned, but of course at the moment they're just these loose collection of gems around the world here. So what we want to do is actually be able to access them at any particular point in time. So to do that, we're going to need to store them in our board script. So in here, I'm going to go right to the top to where I have my gems, and I'm going to create another array that we're going to use. So we're going to create a public gem array that we'll call all gems. But there's one issue with this, and that's that we know we're spawning them in at particular X and Y values. So we want to be able to keep track of them in an X and Y kind of way. But our arrays, if we go back in here, you'll see, hey, this is just a straight one by one, basically a list of objects for us to use. But this won't get us an X and Y value. So we're going to use what's called a 2D array. Now a 2D array, one limitation with it is that we're going to make this now, but we're not going to be able to see it in Unity anymore. If I save this right now as it is, you'll see we have, just let this compile, we have our all gems here, and that's perfectly fine. But if I go back in here now, I'm going to make this a 2D array, and all we do to make it a 2D array is just add a comma in. We're basically saying, hey, this should have two values, one before the comma and one after. But the problem with this is now it's going to, if we save it, this is no longer going to appear in Unity itself. So once this compiles, there we go, it's gone. Because Unity doesn't know how to display a 2D array, because the 2D array can get very, very complicated visually. But we just need to keep it in mind of how this is working. And basically our 2D array is just going to store an X and a Y value for each gem. So when we create a 2D array like this, we have to assign it a certain size. So in our start function here, before we do anything else, we're going to say our all gems array should be equal to a new gem array, and we need to tell it the width and height that we want this to have. So basically just say a new gem array that is width on the x-axis, so our width, and then comma, and then height. Now we can't do that up here because this is when we're actually creating the variable, so it won't allow us to just create this with the width and the height up here. So we have to instantiate it here basically. But now that we have that, down in our spawn gem down here, we can say our all gems at position.x and position.y. So we're basically saying in our all gems array, look at position anywhere between 0 and 7, and position y anywhere between 0 and 7 again. And wherever that is, so wherever we're currently looking at, that should be set to be equal to whatever the gem is that we just spawned. So now we have a way to store that information in our system. Now, of course, like I said, there's no way that we can visually see this, but it's just important to understand how that's working. It's basically creating an imaginary array, whereas that paint I drew in the last video, it's just creating an imaginary array of all these things, and it's just going through each one and saying, hey, we're storing one gem in here, we're storing another one in here, so on. All these different gems being stored into all these different spaces along the way. And that's all just happening in memory, just references to the gems that we have created. So that's all great, but we also want each individual gem themselves to know where they are in the world. So for that, we need to open up the gem script that we created. So let's go back in here and let this compile. There we go. And we'll open up our gem script. And in here, we're going to create some variables up the top here. So we're going to create a public vector2 int that we're going to call posindex. So that's kind of how we're going to store what position our gem should have. And then below it, we're going to have a public board that we'll just call board, and that's just going to be a reference to the board that actually created the gem itself. So because we want to be able to, we're going to want to be able to, for example, make each gem swipe and be able to switch places, and the gems are then going to tell the board that, hey, I moved from my current position to the position of the other gem that we're switching places with. Again, we'll deal with that stuff when we get a bit further down the line, but for now it's just important to note that we need to have these things in place here. Now we need these to be public so that, for example, other things can have access to them. So we're going to want other scripts that we do going forward to be able to access the position index of each individual gem and to be able to access the board. But back in Unity, if I just save this for the moment and go back in Unity, for each individual gem, if I go to my prefabs and look at one of these gems here, the blue gem, you're never actually in Unity here going to be setting any of these values. You're never going to be setting the board value because we're going to make it automatically happen. So we don't want to be able to actually see either of these because they're just cluttering up the inspector. And generally speaking in Unity, you don't really want to have variables displayed that you're not actually going to be able to make any changes to. So let's go back in here, and what I'm going to do is above each one of these, I'm just going to add the tag hide in inspector. So you do a square bracket and just hide in inspector. And basically what that means is now if I save this, those variables still exist, but now once it compiles, we can no longer see them. They're not showing up in Unity because we don't need to see them. We've no real need to have them here at all. Okay, so that's great, but let's go down in here and we're going to create a new function here. We're going to create a public void that we're going to call setupGem. And this one is going to take in two values. So we're going to take in whatever position we should be at. So vector2 int that we'll call pos. And we want to take in a reference to the board. So we're going to say board that we'll just call the board. And then in here, all we're going to do is say that our position index that we created up here, position index should be equal to position. So we're just taking the values from position and setting them to be what is stored in our position index. And then in here, we're going to say the board that we want a reference to should be equal to whatever the board is that's being sent in. So is equal to the board. Okay, so let's save that. And if we go back in here, in our spawn gem here, we're going to say right after we assign it like so, we're going to say, okay, that gem we just created, you call the setupGem function on it. The position we need to pass in is whatever our position is here. So we can just say pos. And the the board that we want is the board that this script is currently running on. And how we can send that in is, because obviously we don't have a reference to that itself here, we can just simply say this. So this is just a way. Oh, it appears I typed this.transform up here and never discussed it. I don't actually need that there. But this is just a simple way of saying, hey, this is the current version of this script that's running in the game. So basically it's saying, hey, that'll be this board right here. Set that to be equal to whatever gem we have spawned. So if I just save this again, no, don't open the folder, save it and go back in here. Once this compiles, we'll let it play. And now for each of these gems, if I select one of them, we do want to keep these hidden in here, but for the moment I'm just going to comment out the hide in inspector just so we can see for our own reference that the board is being assigned correctly. So we always want to double check these things are working the way it expects. So let's go pick a different gem. So it's got the board and it has been assigned 1 1. This one has been assigned 2 6 and so on. This one is 6 6. So all our gems are being assigned correctly, and now they're able to keep track of where they are in our world. So perfect. We now have our gems spawning and we're able to keep track of where they are on the board itself.